The rain had been falling for hours when Julia Marks received the phone call that changed everything. She was sitting by the window of her small home office, paying utility bills and scrolling through old photos on her laptop when the phone vibrated beside her. The number was unfamiliar, the kind that usually belonged to hospitals or insurance agents. A voice, calm, official, and practiced, told her that her husband, Richard Marks, had been in a fatal accident on his way back from a business trip. His car had veered off the highway during a storm, hitting a divider and bursting into flames. He didn't suffer, the voice said softly. Julia remembered that phrase clearly because it was meant to comfort, yet it landed like a blade. She didn't cry at first. Not when she drove to the morgue to identify the body, not when the coroner handed her his wedding ring in a sealed envelope. It wasn't shock, it was disbelief mixed with a strange numbness, as if she were floating above the world, watching her life unravel from a distance. Richard had been her husband for 35 years. They built everything together, a house, a family, a carefully arranged image of success. She had given up her career in accounting when he became a partner at his firm, believing his promise, "You'll never have to worry about money again." She had believed him. The funeral came swiftly. Julia spent the night before choosing his favorite navy suit, the one she had pressed for every board dinner. The morning air was heavy with the scent of lilies and rain-soaked soil. People from the firm came in clusters, polished, composed, whispering condolences like rehearsed lines. Their pity felt mechanical. Julia moved through it all gracefully, making sure every detail was perfect. Richard had cared about appearances. Even in death, she wanted to preserve his illusion of control. Their only child, Michael, stood at the podium to speak. He was 31, tall like his father, with the same square jaw and quiet authority. Julia sat in the front row, her hands clasped together, her heart aching with anticipation. She wanted him to acknowledge her, to thank her for the decades she had spent building the foundation beneath Richard's empire. She thought he might say, "My mother was my father's strength." But when Michael spoke, the world shifted. "My father wasn't alone in his final years," he said, his voice steady but trembling at the edges. There was someone who stood by him through everything. Someone who truly understood him, Miss Caroline Hart. Julia blinked. The name echoed through the chapel like a misplaced chord. Caroline Hart. She had heard that name before. A woman from Richard's office, his executive assistant. She remembered her from a company gala years ago, elegant and self-assured, always near Richard, laughing softly at his jokes. Julia had dismissed her as harmless then, the way a wife dismisses a shadow she doesn't want to see. But now, that shadow had stepped into the light. All eyes turned toward the front row, where Caroline sat, slim, beautiful, dressed in black silk, her face painted with delicate grief. She rose briefly to nod at Michael's words, dabbing a tissue at her eyes. It was the perfect performance. And Julia, the real wife, sat unnoticed, as if her decades of devotion had evaporated into the air. When the service ended, people murmured, "She must have been close to Richard." Julia heard them but didn't react. She shook hands, accepted condolences, and smiled faintly, the way one does when the body is present but the soul has stepped out of the room. Later, she overheard Michael telling Caroline softly, "You were family to him." Family. That night, the house felt colder than ever. Julia wandered from room to room, her footsteps echoing in the silence. His slippers were still by the bed. His coffee mug sat on the kitchen counter. She touched them gently, as if contact could summon the truth. At last, she sat in the living room, staring at the framed wedding photo on the mantel, the young couple smiling, full of faith and promises that time had long since betrayed. And somewhere deep inside, under the layers of hurt, anger began to stir, slow, quiet, dangerous. 3 days later, Julia sat in the lawyer's office, her composure wrapped tightly around her like armor. The lawyer, an older man with tired eyes, began reading the will. She expected the usual, the house, the savings, perhaps a trust for Michael. But when he reached the line that said, "All assets, including real estate and investment holdings, are to be transferred to Miss Caroline Hart," Julia felt her world tilt. Everything. Not a mention of her name. Not a dime. Not even acknowledgement as his legal wife. Michael sat beside her, calm, expressionless, as if this had been no surprise. Julia turned to him slowly. "You knew," she whispered. He didn't look at her. "Dad had his reasons," he said flatly. Her voice shook. "And what about your mother's life? 35 years of it." Michael sighed. "Caroline was there for him, Mom. She made him happy. You were always distant." Julia stared at him, her chest tightening. "Distant," she repeated softly. "I built his world, Michael. And yours." But he didn't meet her eyes. When she left the office, the autumn wind cut through her coat, sharp and merciless. She walked to her car slowly, gripping the steering wheel when she got inside. The truth was simple now, clearer than it had ever been. Her husband had loved another woman, her son had chosen loyalty to a ghost, and she, the wife, the mother, had become invisible. But Julia Marks was not a woman who stayed invisible for long. And deep inside her silence, a plan began to take shape, one that would uncover every secret Richard had buried, one that would make the world remember who she truly was. The morning after the will reading, Julia sat at her dining table with a pot of untouched coffee growing cold beside her. The house was still, suffocatingly quiet, the kind of silence that presses against your chest. For the first time in her life, she realized she was completely alone. Her husband was gone, her son had turned away from her, and everything she had worked for was now in the hands of another woman. But beneath the ache of betrayal, something else had begun to grow, a hard, cold determination. She stared out the window at the gray sky, the same color as the ashes of her past. The world outside went on as usual, cars passing, birds calling, neighbors going to work. It struck her how cruelly normal everything seemed while her world had shattered. That normalcy was unbearable. She needed purpose, a reason to keep breathing. And so, she decided to find the truth. Julia knew Richard had always been meticulous. Every bill, contract, and record had a place. He used to joke, "I don't keep secrets, jewels, I file them." That line echoed in her mind as she climbed the stairs to his home office. The door creaked slightly when she pushed it open. The room smelled faintly of leather and cologne. Everything was still in perfect order. The mahogany desk, the neatly arranged folders, the framed certificates on the wall. His world, untouched by death, mocking her. She sat down at his desk and began to open drawers. The first held pens, the second old tax files, the third, nothing unusual. But in the bottom drawer, beneath a false wooden base she hadn't noticed before, she found a small black notebook. Her breath caught as she pulled it out. Inside were names, dates, and numbers written in Richard's precise handwriting. Offshore accounts, transactions, properties listed under different names, and one name repeated over and over, C. Hart. Caroline Hart. Julia flipped through the pages, each one confirming what her heart already knew. Her husband had built a secret life with another woman, one financed by money that didn't belong to him. She scanned the notes more closely and noticed something else. Deposits from his company into private accounts, labeled as consulting fees. She had worked in accounting once, long ago, before Richard convinced her to give it up. Her instincts returned fast. These weren't consulting fees. They were diversions, company funds disguised as payments. Fraud. She leaned back in her chair, her mind racing. It wasn't just betrayal anymore, it was crime. And if she could prove it, she could destroy everything Caroline had stolen from her. But she couldn't do it alone. There was only one person she trusted enough to call, her old friend, Martha Reynolds, who had once worked as a senior auditor at the same firm before retiring. Julia hadn't spoken to her in years, but Martha answered the phone on the second ring. "Julia Marks," Martha said, surprise in her voice. "It's been ages. Are you all right?" Julia hesitated for a moment. "No," she admitted quietly. "I need your help." Within an hour, Martha was at her door, a laptop bag slung over her shoulder and concern in her sharp gray eyes. Julia poured her coffee. Neither of them touched it. She told her everything, from the will to the notebook to Caroline Hart. Martha listened without interrupting, only nodding slowly now and then. When Julia finished, there was a long silence. Then Martha said softly, "You know, Richard was always too careful to get caught. But if what you're saying is true, we might finally see what kind of man he really was." Together, they began going through the files. Julia fetched boxes of old papers from the attic, tax returns, investment documents, correspondence. They worked late into the night, Martha typing rapidly while Julia cross-checked figures against Richard's handwritten notes. And slowly, the pattern emerged. Richard had funneled millions through dummy corporations, using false invoices to justify the transfers. Caroline's name appeared again and again. She was listed as a consultant or advisor. The evidence was irrefutable. Every line on the spreadsheet was another knife in Julia's heart, but also another piece of power she could use. Around midnight, Julia sat back and rubbed her temples. "He lied about everything," she whispered. "Even love." Martha gave her a sympathetic look. "He didn't just betray you, Julia. He betrayed everyone who trusted him. But you can make it right." Julia stared at the computer screen, the glow reflecting off her tired face. "I will," she said. Over the next week, they compiled everything into a thick file. Martha taught Julia how to trace digital records through the company's archive database, information that legally she wasn't supposed to access anymore. But Julia didn't care. She wasn't doing this for revenge now. She was doing it for justice, for herself, for the years she had been made to feel small. One night, while searching through an encrypted folder, Julia found something that made her blood run cold, a series of emails between Richard and Caroline. The messages weren't just romantic, they were conspiratorial. They discussed transferring ownership of the house, her house, into Caroline's name after Richard's retirement. There was even a draft of a second will, dated months before his death. Julia scrolled through the messages until she reached the final one, sent 2 days before the accident. "Richard, once this deal clears, we'll be free. She won't be a problem anymore. Caroline, she'll never see it coming." Julia stared at the screen, her hands trembling. The words repeated in her head, "She'll never see it coming." She realized then that Richard hadn't just planned to leave her penniless, he had planned to erase her completely. His death might have been an accident, but his intentions were clear. Julia was meant to disappear quietly, like a loose end tied up in the name of love and greed. When Martha saw her pale face, she asked, "Julia, what is it?" Julia turned the laptop toward her. Martha read the email chain silently, then looked up with a grim expression. "You have enough to bury them both," she said. "Legally and publicly." Julia nodded slowly, her voice steady. "Then that's what I'll do." She made an appointment with a new lawyer, one who wasn't connected to Richard's firm. His name was Daniel Pierce, a sharp, calm man in his 40s with a reputation for taking on impossible cases. When Julia handed him the folder, he scanned the documents carefully, his eyebrows rising higher with each page. "This is substantial," he said finally. "If we present this, not only can you challenge the will, but we can open a full investigation into financial misconduct. Caroline Hart won't see a penny." Julia met his gaze. "I don't just want her to lose the money," she said quietly. "I want the world to know what they did." Daniel leaned back, studying her. "Then we'll make sure they do." As Julia left his office that evening, she felt the faintest spark of something she hadn't felt in years, control. The pain was still there, but it no longer owned her. For the first time since the funeral, she walked with her head held high. Outside, the city lights shimmered against the wet pavement. In the reflection of a passing window, Julia saw her own face, older, yes, but sharper now. There was resolve in her eyes. The woman she had been, the obedient wife, the silent supporter, was gone. In her place stood someone new, and this woman would make sure no one ever forgot her name again. The day Julia Marks filed the case was the first day in months she felt alive. She stood outside the courthouse in her dark gray coat, the wind tugging at her hair, and looked up at the marble pillars towering above her. 4 years, she had passed this building without a second glance, but now it was her battlefield. The folder clutched in her hand felt heavy, not just with paper, but with proof, with pain, with purpose. Inside were copies of Richard's secret accounts, Caroline's false contracts, and the email that sealed their deceit. When she walked through those courthouse doors, heads turned. Reporters had already caught wind of a story. Widow challenges late businessman's will, citing fraud and infidelity. They shouted questions as she passed, flashes from cameras flickering across her pale face. Julia didn't answer any of them. She simply kept walking, her heels clicking against the tiled floor like the steady beat of war drums. Daniel Pierce, her lawyer, was waiting inside. They'll try to settle quietly, he warned. Caroline won't want this in the news. But we don't accept silence. We push. Julia nodded. We push. By the next week, the story was everywhere, newspapers, talk shows, online articles. Richard Marks, the respected businessman, now exposed as a fraud who had siphoned company money for personal affairs. Caroline Hart's photograph appeared beside his, her once sophisticated smile now a symbol of scandal. The media swarmed her home, and she released a trembling statement claiming she had no knowledge of Richard's financial dealings. Michael called Julia the same night the story broke. His voice was full of anger. Mom, what are you doing? You're ruining Dad's reputation. Julia closed her eyes, taking a deep breath. Your father ruined his own reputation, Michael. I'm just telling the truth. You're making a fool of yourself, he snapped. You sound bitter. Maybe I am, she said softly, but I'm also right. There was a pause, a long, heavy silence, before Michael hung up without another word. Julia stared at the phone for a moment, then placed it gently on the table. The ache was still there, sharp and deep, but it no longer controlled her. Her fight wasn't for her son's approval anymore. It was for her dignity. 2 days later, Caroline's lawyer sent an offer, a quiet settlement, a generous sum of money if Julia agreed to withdraw her claims and stop speaking publicly. Daniel slid the papers across Julia's kitchen table, his expression unreadable. It's enough to live comfortably for the rest of your life, he said. Julia didn't even glance at the numbers. If I take this, she said, it means they win. Daniel smiled faintly. Then I guess we'll see them in court. The trial began on a gray Monday morning. The courtroom smelled of wood polish and old paper. Julia sat beside Daniel, calm and composed in her dark suit, while Caroline entered surrounded by lawyers and whispers. She looked thinner than before, her once perfect confidence cracked. When their eyes met for the first time, Caroline's expression faltered. Julia didn't look away. The opposing lawyer, a slick man with an expensive tie, tried to dismiss the accusations. He painted Julia as a bitter widow, confused by grief, accusing her late husband of crimes to regain attention. But Daniel countered with precision, presenting document after document. He showed the hidden accounts, the forged consulting contracts, the fake signatures. And then he displayed the emails. When the words, "She'll never see it coming," appeared on the large screen in front of the jury, a hush fell over the room. Even the judge leaned forward. Julia sat motionless, watching Caroline's face drain of color. Caroline's lawyer objected, claiming the emails were fabricated. But Daniel had already called an expert witness, an IT specialist, who confirmed their authenticity beyond doubt. The courtroom buzzed with murmurs. Caroline's composure shattered. She stood up suddenly, her voice trembling. He loved me, she cried out. He was leaving her for me. He said she didn't matter. The room went silent. Julia didn't flinch. She looked directly at Caroline, her voice low but firm. He said a lot of things that weren't true. Caroline sank back into her seat, covering her face with shaking hands. After that day, everything changed. The company released an official statement distancing itself from Richard Marks and confirming an internal investigation into misappropriated funds. Investors pulled out. The empire Richard had built, the same empire Julia had silently supported for decades, crumbled within weeks. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed again. This time, Julia didn't run. She stood before the flashing cameras, her voice calm and measured. My husband was a respected man, she said. But respect built on lies doesn't last. I'm not here for revenge. I'm here because women like me, wives who give up everything, deserve to be seen, to be heard, and to be remembered. Her words spread everywhere. Headlines, television interviews, social media. Some praised her courage. Others accused her of dragging a dead man's name through the mud. Julia didn't care. For the first time, the world knew her story, and it was hers alone. As the weeks passed, the court's momentum turned fully in her favor. Caroline tried to flee the country, but the investigation froze her assets. Michael refused to testify for either side, torn between guilt and pride. Julia didn't try to change his mind anymore. She knew some relationships were too fractured to mend. One evening, Daniel visited her at home with an update. The judge is leaning our way, he said. We could have a verdict within 2 weeks. Julia nodded, though exhaustion showed in her eyes. Thank you, Daniel. For everything. He hesitated, studying her. You know, most people would have taken the settlement. You didn't. That takes strength. Julia gave a faint smile. Strength isn't something I had, she said quietly. It's something I learned. That night, she stood by the window, looking out at the city lights flickering in the rain. So much of her life had been spent waiting for love, for respect, for acknowledgement. But now, she understood that waiting had been her mistake. Strength wasn't given, it was taken. The next morning, she visited Richard's grave for the first time since the funeral. The marble headstone gleamed cold under the gray sky. She placed a single white rose on the grass and stood in silence. I loved you once, she said softly, and maybe part of me always will. But I finally understand something, Richard. Love doesn't mean losing yourself. As she turned to leave, a strange calm settled over her. She didn't look back. The final hearing was scheduled for the following Monday. The world would soon know the full truth, and Julia Marks, the woman everyone had once overlooked, was about to reclaim her name. The courthouse was packed on the morning of the final hearing. News vans lined the streets, reporters gathered at the entrance, and cameras flashed every few seconds as Julia Marks stepped out of the black sedan. She wore a simple black dress and a gray coat, dignified, calm, and unshaken. Her lawyer, Daniel Pierce, walked beside her, his briefcase clutched tightly in his hand. The wind carried whispers of her name. That's her, the widow who exposed the fraud. Inside, the air was tense. Caroline Hart sat at the defendant's table, her once glamorous appearance now drawn and weary. The confident executive who had once smiled beside Richard Marks had been replaced by a woman hollowed out by scandal and fear. Her lawyer looked equally grim. They both knew the evidence was overwhelming. Julia took her seat quietly, her heart steady but heavy. Months of preparation, endless nights of pain, humiliation, and confrontation, it all came down to this. She had relived every betrayal, every moment of invisibility. But today it would end. The judge entered, and the courtroom rose. When everyone was seated again, the final arguments began. Daniel stood first. Your Honor, he said, his voice clear and controlled, this case is not just about money. It is about truth. For over 3 decades, my client, Mrs. Julia Marks, built a life with her husband, trusting in his integrity and devotion. Yet, as the evidence has shown, Richard Marks deceived her, his company, and this court by embezzling funds to maintain an affair with Miss Caroline Hart. Mrs. Marks is not here seeking pity or profit. She seeks justice, to restore what was stolen, and to ensure that deception does not triumph over honesty. He paused, looking briefly at Julia before continuing. We have presented undeniable proof of fraud. False invoices, hidden accounts, falsified signatures, and explicit communications between the late Mr. Marks and Ms. Hart. The defense has offered neither credible explanation nor remorse. Therefore, we respectfully ask that the court overturn the fraudulent will, return all rightful assets to Mrs. Marks, and initiate proceedings against Ms. Hart for her participation in the scheme. The judge nodded solemnly. Thank you, Mr. Pierce. Then it was the defense's turn. Caroline's lawyer rose, his voice tight with desperation. Your Honor, my client is not a criminal. She was misled by a man she loved. Richard Marks was the architect of this deception, and now that he's gone, we are punishing the wrong person. Ms. Hart has suffered enough. Public humiliation, loss of employment, and emotional trauma. She has nothing left. Julia stared at Caroline as he spoke. For a brief moment, she almost pitied her. Almost. But then she remembered the emails, the ones that read, she'll never see it coming. Whatever sympathy she might have felt evaporated. When the final statements concluded, the judge called for a short recess before delivering the verdict. Julia sat quietly at her table, her hands folded neatly. The courtroom buzzed with tension, reporters whispering, pens scratching across notepads, spectators waiting for the outcome of a story that had gripped the city for months. Daniel leaned toward her. Whatever happens, Julia, you've already won. The truth is out. She gave a faint smile. The truth was all I ever wanted. After 20 long minutes, the judge returned. The courtroom fell silent. I have reviewed all evidence and testimony, he began. It is clear that substantial fraud was committed by the late Richard Marks, with the assistance of Ms. Caroline Hart. The will presented before this court is invalid, having been drafted under false pretenses and with the intent to conceal illicitly gained assets. Therefore, the court rules in favor of the plaintiff, Mrs. Julia Marks. There was a collective gasp. Julia's eyes closed briefly as the words sank in. The judge continued, all assets will revert to Mrs. Marks as the rightful spouse and legal heir. Furthermore, given the compelling evidence of Ms. Hart's involvement in fraudulent activities, this court is recommending immediate investigation and criminal charges. Caroline's head dropped into her hands. Tears streaked her mascara as photographers outside began scrambling for headlines. Her lawyer whispered something urgently, but she didn't seem to hear. Julia remained still, composed. She didn't smile, didn't gloat. There was no triumph in her eyes, only quiet release. Years of pain had finally been acknowledged, and the truth had spoken for her. When the judge dismissed the court, Daniel turned to her with a grin. It's over, Julia. You did it. She nodded slowly, her voice soft. Yes, it's over. But it wasn't really over, not yet. Outside, cameras swarmed again. Microphones were pushed toward her face. Mrs. Marks, how does it feel to win? One reporter shouted. What would you say to Caroline Hart? Julia paused at the courthouse steps. The flashbulbs were blinding, but she didn't flinch. I don't feel like I've won, she said calmly. This was never a victory. It was a reckoning. What happened here is what happens when truth is buried under lies for too long. It eventually finds its way back to the surface. The crowd fell silent, hanging on her words. She continued, to every woman who's ever been silenced, deceived, or made to feel invisible, don't wait for someone to give you power. Take it back, piece by piece, day by day. Her voice didn't shake. It carried over the crowd, strong and steady, the voice of a woman who had found herself again. That evening, she sat in her garden with a cup of tea, the sun setting behind the trees. The air smelled of wet grass and new beginnings. Martha called to congratulate her, her voice warm with pride. You did it, Jules, she said. You made them all see who you really are. Julia smiled faintly. For the first time, I see it too. After the call ended, she walked to the edge of the garden where the hydrangeas had begun to bloom again. She knelt, touching the soft petals gently. They reminded her of her younger self, delicate, uncertain, yet capable of enduring every storm. Her thoughts drifted to Michael. He hadn't spoken to her since the trial began. She didn't know if he had followed the hearings or if he even cared. But somewhere deep inside, she still hoped he might one day understand, not to forgive her, but to see the truth for himself. She went inside, the old house quiet around her. In the hallway, she passed the wedding photograph again. This time, she didn't look away. She took it from the wall and placed it in a drawer. Not out of anger, but closure. That night, Julia slept peacefully for the first time in years. No nightmares, no ghosts, only stillness. When morning came, sunlight streamed through the curtains. She stood before the mirror, studying her reflection. There were fine lines around her eyes, silver strands in her hair, but her face had a new strength, the kind born from survival. The woman who stared back wasn't the same Julia Marks who had wept in the morgue months ago. This was someone who had faced the fire and walked through it. She smiled, small, genuine, free. Tomorrow, she decided, she would visit her son. She didn't know if he would open the door, but she would try, because even though her life had been rebuilt from the ruins, she still believed in healing. As she prepared for bed that night, Julia whispered softly to the empty room, "It's time to begin again." And for the first time, she truly meant it. The autumn sun stretched lazily across the sky as Julia stood at the edge of the quiet suburban street, clutching a small box of photographs in her hands. It had been 3 weeks since the trial, 3 weeks of silence, reflection, and a kind of stillness she hadn't known in years. Her home was hers again, her name restored, her reputation cleared. Yet, one thing remained unsettled, her son. Michael had not called, not written, not sent a message. Every night, she found herself walking past his old room, pausing at the door, half expecting his voice. But the house only offered echoes. That morning, She had finally decided. She would go to him. Not to justify or plead, but to tell him the truth. Not the courtroom's version, not the media's, but her own. She took a deep breath and walked toward the white townhouse with the green shutters, his home. The garden was neatly trimmed, the front porch filled with small pots of lavender. When he opened the door, surprise flashed in his eyes. He looked older, more distant, but still her boy. "Mom," he said quietly, "I didn't expect." "I know," she interrupted softly. "I just wanted to talk. For a minute." Michael hesitated, then stepped aside. "Come in." Inside, everything smelled faintly of coffee and wood polish. Family photos lined the walls, his wedding, his children, even a few from his childhood. Julia's gaze lingered on one picture, the three of them at the lake, years ago, laughing under the summer sun. "You look well," she said, forcing a smile. "I've been busy," he replied, sitting across from her. The space between them felt like a canyon. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then Julia placed the small box on the table and slid it toward him. "These belong to your father," she said. "Letters, documents, old photos. You deserve to see them. All of them." He frowned, his expression conflicted. "Mom, I don't." "Just read them," she said gently. "After the trial, I thought I'd feel vindicated. But the truth is, I only felt tired. I'm not here to reopen wounds. I just want you to know that everything I did to protect what was real." He looked at her, uncertainty flickering in his eyes. "I don't even know what's real anymore." Julia nodded slowly. "I didn't either. For a long time, I believed your father's lies because it was easier than facing the truth. And when I finally did, it destroyed everything. But you have to understand, Michael, your father wasn't just unfaithful, he was lost. I think part of me was, too." She reached into her bag and took out one more item, an old letter, folded and worn. "He wrote this to me 2 weeks before he died. I never showed it to anyone." She handed it to him. Her hands trembled slightly as he unfolded it. The handwriting was unmistakable, Richard's smooth, slanted script. "Julia, if you ever find this, I want you to know that I'm sorry, not just for what I've done, but for what I've become. Caroline was never love. It was escape. You gave me 30 years of devotion, and I gave you a stranger in return. If I could undo it all, I would. I know I don't deserve forgiveness, but I hope one day you'll find peace, even if it's without me. R." When Michael finished reading, his face softened, grief replacing anger. "He really wrote this?" he asked quietly. Julia nodded. "He did, and that's why I could finally let go. Because I realize forgiveness isn't about them, it's about freeing yourself from the weight they left behind." Michael's shoulders slumped. "I was so angry at you. I thought you wanted revenge. I thought you were destroying his memory." Julia's eyes filled with tears. "I wasn't destroying it, Michael. I was saving the part of it that was still true. You deserve to know the man he really was, not the story he created." For the first time in months, he reached across the table, his hand covering hers. "I'm sorry, Mom." She squeezed his hand, smiling through tears. "You don't have to be. We both lost something. But maybe we can start again." The heaviness between them began to lift, replaced by a fragile understanding, a bridge slowly rebuilding itself after years of ruin. They spent the rest of the afternoon talking. About childhood memories, about Richard, about the little things that had once held their family together. Julia laughed for the first time in a long time. Not a polite smile, but a genuine laugh that filled the room like sunlight. When she finally stood to leave, Michael walked her to the door. "Come for dinner next week," he said. "The kids would love to see you." She smiled. "I'd love that." Outside, the sky had begun to glow with the colors of dusk, gold fading into rose and violet. Julia walked slowly down the path, feeling lighter with every step. That night, back at home, she poured herself a glass of wine and sat by the window. The city lights flickered in the distance, and somewhere a radio played a soft old tune. She thought of everything that had happened. The love, the lies, the loss, the trial, and for the first time, she didn't feel haunted by it. She picked up her journal, opened to a clean page, and began to write. "Today I saw my son again. He looked like his father once did, proud, stubborn, but kind underneath it all. We spoke honestly. I told him everything. And I think, maybe he heard me. The world feels quieter tonight. Not empty, just peaceful. Maybe this is what healing looks like. Not forgetting, but forgiving. She closed the book, set it aside, and watched the moon rise through the window. The next morning, Julia woke early. The house was filled with sunlight, soft and warm. She brewed coffee, opened the back door, and stepped into the garden. The hydrangeas were in full bloom, a sea of white and pale blue, swaying gently in the breeze. As she stood there, a calm realization washed over her. She had survived. Not just the betrayal, or the humiliation, or the loneliness, but the silence that came after. She had rebuilt herself, piece by piece, not as Richard's wife or the victim of scandal, but as Julia Marks, a woman whole on her own. She whispered to the morning air, "Thank you," though she wasn't sure to whom. Maybe to life. Maybe to herself. Later that day, she sat at her desk and began drafting plans for a new foundation, one to support women facing legal and financial manipulation in marriages. It would be called the Renewal Trust. Daniel had already agreed to help. Martha promised to volunteer. It felt right, turning pain into purpose. As the months passed, the headlines faded. Caroline Hart was sentenced to community service and fined heavily for her role in the fraud. The media moved on. Julia's name became less of a scandal and more of a symbol, quiet resilience, unwavering grace. One afternoon, she received a letter in the mail. No return address. Inside was a single line, written in Caroline's handwriting. "I hope you found peace. I'm still looking for mine." Julia folded the note and placed it in a drawer beside Richard's old letter. She didn't feel anger, only understanding. Everyone was searching for redemption in their own way. That evening, she hosted dinner for her family. Laughter filled the house again. Michael's children running in the hallways, Martha telling her usual stories, Daniel dropping by with a bottle of wine. The emptiness that once echoed through those rooms was gone, replaced by warmth and life. As she stood by the window later that night, watching the lights shimmer across the garden, Julia realized something profound. Healing wasn't an ending. It was a beginning that came softly, without warning, like dawn after a long night. She closed her eyes, breathed deeply, and whispered, "I'm home." And this time she truly was.